It's a familiar story, the story of Thomas, or as history has nicknamed him, Doubting Thomas. I think he gets a bad rap because he did not believe, or maybe because others doubted too. Thomas was simply the one who said it out loud. Think about it. His rabbi, his teacher, his master of 3 years, was tried, was scourged, was made to carry a cross, was nailed to a tree. It was all simply too much for Thomas. He had put his hopes in Jesus, and they killed him. He had come to believe here was the Messiah, and they killed him. He thought here was salvation that was promised from the Lord, and they killed him. He was laid in the tomb, and even though Scripture doesn't recount it, I'm sure Thomas was there. I'm sure they were all there, even though they had deserted Jesus at his death. Maybe they were watching from afar, but they had placed Jesus into this tomb. They had sealed it with a stone. There's such a finality to that event. It had all come down to this. After 3 years of companionship and ministry and itinerant preaching, after 3 years of miracles and healings, after 3 years of hopes and dreams, everything sealed in that tomb. So I imagine Thomas wept. And I imagine this was a very painful experience for him, that he was filled with grief. So maybe he was off by himself, crying, mourning the loss of Jesus. Maybe that's why he wasn't there with the others when Jesus appeared the first time. I can imagine a grief-stricken Thomas, inconsolable, crying as he walks into the room. And what does he get? He gets happy people. Wouldn't you be upset? Here he is, sad, dejected, mourning. He's been crying all day. And then some happy, perky disciple runs, guess what? We've seen the Lord. I imagine Thomas would have said, what in the world are you talking about? Seen the Lord. They killed him. We buried him. What in the world are you talking about? So imagine the scenario. Anybody you know who's mourning and is sad, somebody in grief, you try to console them. Don't cry, you say. It will get better, you say. And the person just looks at you and says, what are you talking about? The person who is crying, the person who is mourning, doesn't necessarily want that. That person wants to mourn. He wants to feel what he feels. She wants to cry and mourn. I'm sure you've all had the experience, and I think that's probably what Thomas felt. And the only thing that was going to make him feel better was Jesus. Actually experiencing Jesus. Actually being with Jesus, and that's the only thing he would believe. So I think it's too easy for us to say that Thomas was doubting, because we haven't been in his position. I think Thomas actually had a great reaction. My Lord and my God. We say it at Mass every week, right? At the consecration, the words of Thomas, not the words of Andrew, not the words of Simon, not the words of James, the words of Thomas, my Lord and my God. Because just like Thomas, when we finally recognize the presence of Jesus, it fills us with joy. When Jesus comes into our midst in the Eucharist, we are consoled. When we encounter the living God, we are comforted. You've all seen paintings of this scene. There's a very famous painting by the Italian master Caravaggio called The Incredulity of St. Thomas in a museum in Potsdam, Germany. And I love it because it's so thoroughly human. It's almost as if Thomas is hesitating. My Lord and my God, I think he thinks. That's all I need to see. And Jesus takes his hand. Jesus takes Thomas's hand and says, go ahead. Into the wound in my side, right there. Feel it. And he takes Thomas's finger in this painting and he sticks it in. But it's not just Thomas. I'm sure all the other disciples wanted proof. I'm sure they were all curious to find out who this was in front of them. because they were faced with a flesh and blood Jesus. Not a ghost, not an image, but flesh and blood. And that's really hard to understand. And it's even harder to believe. So why not stick your finger in the wound in his side and find out what this is all about? I have yet to meet someone who completely understands what the resurrection is. It's a very difficult concept, which is probably why I have such affection for Thomas. Because I am like Thomas. I question, I doubt, I'm always looking for proof. I know I'm not going to get it, but I still want it, and I probably always will. None of us here, no one here, has put our fingers into the nail marks in Jesus' hands. None of us have put our hands into the wounds in his side. None of us has experienced the empty tomb. I don't think any of us has experienced an angel telling us that he is not here. He has been raised. But we do know, as the first disciples were told, to search for him among the living in this community of believers that has adopted his name. We are all here because in one way or another we believe. We doubt, we question, but we believe. And therefore we are witness to that belief. We know so much about the experience of the resurrection. How it changed a group of cowardly Galilean fishermen into a band of missionaries who proclaimed the good news until their death. We know so much about the experience of the resurrection. How an encounter with the risen Jesus turned a Pharisee named Saul into an apostle named Paul. We know so much about the experience of the resurrection, about how a small group of believers expelled from the synagogue spread to the four corners of the earth. We know so much about the experience of the resurrection, and yet we really know nothing about it. It seems that how we experience the resurrection and relate to the risen Jesus is more important than the mechanics of the event itself. What matters is that the community of believers was able to gather then, as we do today, and proclaim that Jesus Christ is risen indeed, that Jesus Christ is alive in our hearts, that Jesus Christ has given us hope of something better to come. And that, brothers and sisters, is good news. That we can say the Lord is risen, that he is risen indeed.